After my father-in-law death, my wife became the CEO. She didn't know that I owned 71% stake in the company.
A week later, the board announced that we have decided to terminate your position, pack your things right away. I just smiled, thanked them, and told them Monday would be fun.
They took my seat. I took their company. I'm Evan. I'm 34. And until last Friday, I was technically employed at Harrison Technologies, a mid-sized manufacturing firm my late father-in-law, Thomas Harrison, founded 40 years ago. I say technically because no one ever treated my role as real. To the board of directors, I wasn't an executive, an analyst, or even a liability. I was a placeholder, a punchline. The trust fund's son-in-law who married the boss's daughter and wandered the halls pretending to work. They called me the son-in-law with no real job, usually in whispers just loud enough to be overheard. This judgment, incidentally, came from men who couldn't reconcile a checking account without phoning their accountants. They had no idea what was coming. Let me rewind. I met Lena, Thomas's daughter, 7 years ago. Thomas was a genuine outlier in modern corporate leadership. He understood balance sheets, yes, but he also understood factories, people, and consequences. He didn't talk in buzzwords. He talked in margins, logistics, and failure points. Over time, Thomas became more than my father-in-law. He became my mentor, my confidant, my chess opponent. We spent countless nights in his study, expensive scotch between us, dismantling the board's incompetence one move at a time. We laughed about it, but beneath the humor was planning. Quiet, deliberate planning for the day Harrison Technologies would need protection from the very people running it. Everyone else saw me as ornamental. Thomas saw something else entirely. He didn't teach me the polished MBA fantasy version of business. He taught me the ugly version. The version where you walk factory floors at 2 a.m. because a line went down. Where you learn which suppliers cut corners and which foremen quietly hold everything together. He taught me that knowing an employee's name mattered more than memorizing a mission statement. He taught me that stock price obsession was how companies hollowed themselves out. Most importantly, he recognized that I cared about the company, not just the optics. 3 years ago, Lena and I got married. I joined Harrison Technologies in a deliberately vague analyst role. No authority, no spotlight, no respect. The board treated me like office furniture. I overheard that exact phrase at least a dozen times. To them, I was the guy who married well and failed to become a ruthless corporate stereotype. Perfect. Underestimation is a powerful asset. 6 months ago, Thomas was diagnosed with terminal cancer. 3 weeks before he died, he called me into his study. He poured us both 3 fingers of his favorite whiskey, sat down heavily, and slid a folder across his desk like it was nothing more than quarterly reports. He told me calmly that the doctors gave him a month, maybe 2. And he'd be damned if he let those parasites dismantle what he built. Inside the folder were share transfer documents granting me 71% controlling interest in Harrison Technologies. A clean checkmate. He made me promise to keep it secret, especially from Lena. He loved his daughter, but he knew her limits. Lena understood branding, optics, and image. She believed leadership was aesthetic. She once showed me a Pinterest board labeled CEO Vibes before Thomas was even buried. We had everything notarized. Attorneys present. Independent witnesses. A notary named Gladys from a suburban strip mall office who had no idea she just authenticated a corporate nuclear device. Thomas even completed an expert-level Sudoku puzzle in under 8 minutes that day, just to leave extra proof of mental competence. The man thought of everything. Thomas's funeral 3 weeks ago felt like a corporate theater production. Dramatic organ music, performative grief, strategic handshakes. Lena stood front and center in a designer black dress that leaned more red carpet than morning. The board watched her like hyenas circling fresh meat. Charles Whitman, the silver-haired chairman who looked like he'd been born in a 3-piece suit, kept adjusting his tie and exchanging loaded glances. Mark Reynolds, whose personality could best be described as damp cardboard, practically vibrated with anticipation. I could see him mentally rearranging Thomas's corner office. Behind me, someone whispered that I didn't even have a real position, that I just showed up sometimes and played on my computer. They weren't entirely wrong. I didn't have a flashy title, no corner office, no stack of embossed business cards. What I did have was Thomas's trust, a legitimate business degree from Northwestern that I actually earned, and an ability to read corporate nonsense that would make a professional poker player sweat. After the funeral, Lena threw what she called an appointment celebration. It was, functionally, a coronation. The penthouse ballroom looked like nouveau rich desperation made physical. Ice sculptures shaped like the company logo melted under hot lights, pooling corporate symbolism on marble floors. There was a champagne fountain, because of course there was, and a string quartet no one listened to because networking took priority. The board members, who couldn't name a single factory supervisor, clustered around Lena, toasting bold leadership and new eras. Charles held court near the bar, loudly declaring he'd always known Lena had the vision to lead. This was the same man who told Thomas 6 months earlier that women were too emotional for executive roles. Funny how fast ideology bends when money speaks. Mark found me near one of the collapsing ice sculptures. He stood too close, martini in hand, his gin breath and cologne forming an olfactory assault reminiscent of an old factory fire. He clapped my back with the forced sympathy usually reserved for underperforming interns and disobedient dogs. He joked about my tough luck, about going from CEO's son-in-law to whatever it was I did now. He laughed at his own cruelty, pretending it was humor. Other board members hovered nearby, pretending not to listen. I smiled. I told him I was breathing and collecting dividends, which honestly was exhausting. Sometimes I had to sit down, because while they were celebrating titles and optics, while they were rearranging seats and congratulating themselves, they had already lost. They took my seat, and I took their company. He laughed harder, completely unaware that he'd just congratulated the person who now owned his professional fate. The sound carried too long, too confidently. The way people laugh when they believe the ground beneath them is permanent. Over Mark's shoulder, Charles was watching us with hawk-like focus, his eyes sharp, calculating. He was trying to decide which category I belonged in. Potential problem or harmless ornament. Would I push back, make noise, complicate things, or would I fade quietly into the background, another trust fund accessory who mistook proximity to power for power itself? Charles, like most men who climb high on other people's work, was terrible at recognizing danger when it didn't announce itself loudly. The thing about being underestimated is that it functions like a superpower no one sees coming. People tell you everything when they don't think you matter. They make plans in front of you. They joke about you. They assume your silence is stupidity rather than restraint. While Mark was busy mentally composing tragic anecdotes about poor Evan and his sad little analyst role, I was doing something far more useful, mapping out exactly how long it would take to dismantle his entire career from the inside. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I wanted to be thorough. Less if I was feeling efficient. Friday morning arrived with the inevitability of a freight train no one had scheduled. At precisely 9:30 a.m., I received an email from Charles's assistant requesting my presence in conference room A. The message was short, formal, stripped of any human warmth. It read less like a meeting request and more like a legal notification. No greeting, no context, just a time, a place, and an expectation of obedience. Conference room A was reserved for theater. It was the largest room in the building, designed specifically to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, a sweeping view meant to remind you how small you were in comparison to the city, the company, the machine. The tables stretched so long it looked capable of hosting aircraft landings. Entire departments had been erased from existence inside those walls. 6 board members were already seated when I walked in. Charles occupied the head of the table, naturally, as though the chair itself belonged to him by birthright. Mark sat to his right, wearing a smile that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment in a mirror. Gerald Foster was half asleep, his chin dipping toward his chest, which ironically made him the least dangerous person present. The remaining 3 were faces I recognized, but names I couldn't reliably attach, men promoted beyond competence, buoyed upward by proximity and silence. Charles cleared his throat with exaggerated gravitas. It was the kind of throat-clearing people do when they've practiced what comes next and want an audience to feel the weight of it. He said my name the way someone addresses a misbehaving appliance, then launched into a prepared monologue about organizational restructuring, strategic realignment, and resource optimization. It was corporate language in its purest form, elegant, authoritative, and utterly empty. Mark leaned forward, barely able to contain himself. He looked like a child desperate to announce bad news he thought would devastate the recipient. He informed me, almost gleefully, that my position was being terminated effective immediately. The room went quiet. One man began typing furiously on his iPad, likely documenting the moment for reasons even he didn't fully understand. Olivia Grant, the CFO, and the only person at the table with actual operational intelligence, stared down at her hands as if they might offer guidance. She avoided my eyes completely. They waited. They expected panic. Negotiation, anger, tears. The entire firing ritual depends on the recipient performing distress so the executioners can feel justified. Instead, I smiled. I told them this was perfect. That I'd been concerned they might make the process uncomfortable. I thanked them for the efficiency and expressed genuine appreciation for sparing me the indignity of a prolonged HR exit interview. Their expressions flickered, smiles stalling mid-performance like faulty light bulbs. This wasn't the script. Charles's forehead tightened in a way that suggested his Botox was being pushed to its structural limits. I stood, straightened my tie, gathered my belongings with casual precision, as though I were leaving a cafe rather than a career. I picked up the expensive pen they'd given me years earlier, corporate swag masquerading as sentiment, and slipped it into my pocket. I told them it was just business. Companies evolve. People move on. The circle of corporate life. As I walked toward the door, confusion radiated from the table in palpable waves. At the threshold, I turned back and offered them my best genuine smile. I thanked them for the education, said I'd learned a great deal about corporate governance, strategic planning, and the creative limits of expense account fraud. Olivia actually inhaled sharply, as if she'd forgotten how breathing worked. That weekend was glorious. I opened the safe concealed behind an abstract painting in my home office. Lena had always dismissed it as aggressively boring art, something she'd purchased at a charity auction because the artist was emerging, which apparently justified a $5,000 price tag for what resembled a toddler's finger painting. She never questioned why it was bolted so securely to the wall. Behind it sat a biometric safe Thomas, and I had installed one weekend while Lena was in Milan, doing whatever wealthy people do when they're bored in Europe. Inside was the document that would turn Harrison Technologies inside out. The notarized transfer of 71% controlling shares, signed by Thomas 3 weeks before his death. Witnessed by his personal attorney, my lawyer Jennifer Grant, and Gladys the notary, who had unknowingly authenticated a corporate detonation device. The paper itself felt heavy, expensive, authoritative. Important documents announced themselves without saying a word. I photographed it and sent it to Jennifer with a simple message, asking how our position looked now that I'd been fired. Her reply came in under 30 seconds. 3 independent firms had reviewed it. The transfer was ironclad, legally unassailable. She told me to sit tight, let them continue embarrassing themselves, and congratulated me on the impeccable timing of my termination. I followed her advice. From a distance, I watched the board celebrate. Champagne appeared, titles were reshuffled like musical chairs at a cutthroat birthday party. Rumors began spreading almost immediately. By Monday afternoon, according to Dave, the security guard in the lobby. Dave had always been friendly because I'd learned his name and asked about his kids. He told me people upstairs were saying I'd had some kind of breakdown. He dismissed it outright, said I was the most normal person in the building. By Wednesday, the rumors had evolved into full-blown fiction. According to accounting gossip, I'd screamed at Lena, thrown a laptop at Mark, been caught day drinking in my office, and was possibly defecting to a competitor. My favorite involved an affair with someone in HR, completely false and strangely detailed. Lena called once, Thursday evening. She said people were talking and that I was making her look bad. I almost laughed. After all, I hadn't lost anything. I'd just let them believe I had. I told her I'd been fired from a job that barely existed in the first place. And if that somehow reflected poorly on her image, then maybe the issue wasn't me. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line, the sound someone makes when they realize they aren't getting the response they expected. She hung up without saying goodbye. No final jab, no dramatic exit, just silence. Meanwhile, Jennifer kept me thoroughly entertained all weekend. Her texts ranged from clinically informative to laugh-out-loud funny, depending on what fresh nonsense the board had managed to generate in my absence. Saturday afternoon, she forwarded me a set of internal board meeting minutes that had accidentally leaked their way to her. They were already discussing plans to sell off 2 subsidiaries, calling it a strategic divestment to maximize shareholder value. Corporate euphemism at its finest. In reality, both subsidiaries were profitable. Not just marginally, either real growth trajectories, strong management teams, solid future prospects. They were selling off the healthy organs to make the patient look slimmer for a quarterly report. The goal wasn't sustainability. It was optics, juice the numbers, inflate the short-term stock value, cash out, and leave someone else holding the wreckage. It was so predictable it bordered on parody. This was exactly what Thomas had warned me about, exactly what he'd seen coming years in advance. Short-sighted executives always follow the same script: sacrifice long-term stability for short-term rewards that make their stock options sparkle. Thomas hadn't built Harrison Technologies to be flipped like a house with bad plumbing. He'd built it to last, which was why he'd made his move when he did. Sunday afternoon, I sat in my home office going through the financial reports Jennifer sent over. 3 reports in, I was already scribbling margin notes, like a professor grading papers from students who hadn't read the syllabus. The level of incompetence was almost impressive. They planned to sell Anderson Manufacturing to a private equity firm for significantly less than its actual valuation. The numbers didn't justify the price. The timeline didn't justify the urgency. The only explanation that made sense was that someone on the board had a relationship and expected to benefit personally. The tech startup, Neural Sync, was even worse. It was developing genuinely innovative AI applications for manufacturing automation. Technology that could redefine production efficiency over the next decade. The board was shopping it to competitors like a garage sale item. Watching them handle it felt like watching someone sell a pristine classic car for scrap because they couldn't be bothered to learn how an engine worked. Sunday night, my phone rang. Mark Reynolds. I stared at his name on the screen for a solid 10 seconds, weighing whether answering would be worth the entertainment value. Curiosity won. It usually does. His voice came through with forced cheerfulness, the tone of a man who was either mildly drunk or about to ask for something uncomfortable. Possibly both. He asked how my weekend was, how I was processing everything after the termination. I told him I was processing my emotions thoughtfully, reassessing my life choices, and making waffles. The waffles, I added, were excellent. There was a pause, the kind of pause where someone is trying to decide whether they're being mocked. Mark never handled ambiguity well. He said he was calling friend to friend, totally off the record, because he knew a guy at a small firm downtown who was always looking for talent. He could help me land on my feet, put in a good word. The condescension was so thick it was practically structural. Mark was offering me an entry-level analyst role like he was throwing a rope to a drowning man. I asked him very politely whether the firm needed someone to buy them out by Monday, because I had some capital freed up and was always interested in investment opportunities. Silence. Beautiful, immaculate silence. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Mark's head, smoke coming out somewhere behind his ears. He eventually recovered enough to clarify that he meant an analyst role, entry level, to get me back in the game. I told him I understood perfectly. I just figured if we were talking about downtown firms, we might as well think big, but if they needed an analyst, he could send me the information. Mark didn't laugh. He never got jokes unless they came with bullet points and a follow-up email. Monday morning, I put on my best Navy suit. The one Lena once said made me look like a well-paid accountant. At the time, I'd taken it as an insult. Now, I appreciated the accuracy. Accountants are overlooked, underestimated, and quietly aware of where every body is buried. I paired it with a crisp white shirt, a burgundy tie Thomas had given me 2 Christmases ago, and cufflinks that had belonged to his father. Not flashy, deliberate. The Harrison building looked unchanged. Glass and steel reaching into the Chicago sky. The company logo emblazoned on the side, letters large enough to be seen from orbit. Security stopped me before I reached the elevators. Dave wasn't there. Instead, it was Marcus, built like a former linebacker and deeply committed to his role as human barricade. Janet from HR had to escort me upstairs. The same Janet who'd processed my termination paperwork on Friday with the emotional engagement of someone filing a grocery receipt. We rode up in silence. She clutched her tablet like a shield. I hummed the theme from the good, the bad, and the ugly, because if you're walking into a showdown, ambience matters. She finally said this was highly irregular. I told her I appreciated that. I acknowledged it wasn't in her job description and added, truthfully, that I'd always found her professional. She asked if I was about to do something crazy. I asked her to define crazy, because from my perspective, a board dismantling profitable subsidiaries to pad their own exit strategies qualified far more than a conversation. The boardroom froze when I walked in. Every face locked into that particular expression reserved for unexpected problems. Mark nearly choked on his coffee, sputtering like an old lawnmower. Charles's face moved through confusion recognition, and then the first flicker of realization that something had gone very wrong with his Monday morning. I greeted them cheerfully, set my briefcase down with a solid thunk, apologized to Olivia for being gender-exclusive in my greeting, complimented the morning, mentioned I'd seen a cardinal on the way in. Good luck, apparently. Charles squinted at me and said slowly that I didn't work there anymore. I agreed completely. Absolutely correct. Fired on Friday. Memorable event. Quite dramatic, really, though Gerald falling asleep halfway through did soften the impact. Gerald startled awake at his name. I continued calmly. While I didn't work there anymore, I did own there. And ownership tends to complicate meetings. I placed the folder on the table right at the center. The sound of paper hitting polished wood echoed far louder than it should have. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. The folder was impossible to miss. Boldly labeled, Transfer of Controlling Interest Harrison Technologies, Inc. Crisp legal font. It sat at the center of the table like an unexploded device. Mark reached for it first. Of course he did. His hand trembled just enough to betray what his mouth hadn't caught up to yet. I watched his expression shift in stages, confidence evaporating into confusion, confusion sliding into concern, concern collapsing into outright horror. By the time he reached the last page, devastation had settled in fully. He whispered that it couldn't be real, but his voice fractured in a way that made it clear he knew it was. He started talking fast, words tumbling over each other as if speed alone might undo reality. He asked how anyone could expect them to believe Thomas would hand over controlling interest to me, to someone who didn't even have a real job, someone who couldn't even hold onto a basic analyst position. His pitch climbed higher with every sentence, until he sounded like he was auditioning for a high school drama production instead of sitting in a boardroom facing the end of his career. I raised one finger, calmly. First, they fired me, so the whole couldn't hold a job narrative was a retroactive fantasy. Second, they were free to believe whatever bedtime story helped them sleep. I didn't require belief. I had documentation, mountains of it, properly notarized. Witnessed, reviewed by multiple independent legal teams, filed with the SEC. Legal paperwork doesn't care about ego or opinion. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out strained, almost strangled. He said this would destabilize the entire company. The shareholders, investor confidence, the market. I cut him off mid-speech. They'd already done that. They'd been destabilizing the company for years through incompetence and self-interest. I wasn't there to break Harrison Technologies. I was there to stop the bleeding. Think of me as a very polite hurricane. Olivia let out a short, involuntary snort, quickly covering it with a cough when Charles shot her a murderous glare. The sound was brief, but it was enough to fracture what little authority he had left. Then my phone buzzed loudly on the table. I glanced at the screen and smiled wider than I had all morning. Anderson Holdings, our largest external investor. Timing like that couldn't be scripted. I answered deliberately and put the call on speaker, setting the phone in the center of the table so no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. Maria Martinez's voice filled the room, calm, precise. She said she was calling regarding developments related to Harrison Technologies' ownership structure and requested an immediate meeting if possible. Charles visibly drained of color. His face shifted from angry red to an unhealthy gray. Anderson Holdings owned 18% of the remaining shares. Not enough for control, but more than enough to make or break any major move. I told Maria I was already in a board meeting discussing the transition, asked if 2 o'clock worked. She replied that it did, her offices. Bring my attorney and the CFO. They had concerns, particularly about the board's recent decisions. I agreed immediately. I said Jennifer Grant would attend as legal counsel, and I'd bring Olivia Grant as well, assuming she was willing to step into the CFO role officially. I looked at Olivia. She looked like she'd simultaneously won the lottery and been drafted into a war. Maria added, casually, that Anderson Holdings looked forward to working with leadership that actually understood fiduciary responsibility. Then the line went dead. That final sentence lingered in the room like a grenade with the pin removed. No one spoke. Mark stared at the table as if it might swallow him whole. He looked like a man who'd just been told Santa wasn't real, and his childhood dog had been sent to a very different kind of farm. His entire worldview was collapsing in real time. He whispered that this was insane, but there was no fight left in his voice, just resignation. The sound of someone realizing the game had ended, and badly. From the far end of the table, Gerald cleared his throat and announced he was retiring. Effective immediately. His wife wanted to travel, see Italy. Maybe take a painting class. He said it felt like the right moment. Charles tried to object, but Gerald cut him off, standing with more energy than I'd seen from him in years. At 72, with more money than he could reasonably spend and no patience left for stress, he had nothing to lose. He told me quietly that Maria Martinez didn't suffer fools. Then he advised me to clean house before the meeting. He nodded once and walked out. I told the remaining board members to take a breath and reconvene later. We had 4 hours before my meeting at 2 o'clock. 4 hours to prepare an explanation for why they were attempting to sell Anderson Manufacturing. I asked Olivia to assemble every financial document related to the proposed sale. All of it. No summaries, no curated decks. I wanted raw numbers. She nodded and opened her laptop immediately, saying she'd have it ready within the hour. Then she added quietly that she'd voted against the sale. It was documented in the minutes. I told her I knew. That was why she still had a job. Mark finally spoke again. His voice was small. He asked if I was really going to do this. Just take over. I paused at the door and looked back at him. I already had. At precisely 2 o'clock, I walked into Maria Martinez's offices on the 47th floor, with Jennifer and Olivia beside me. Maria's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who made her first billion before most people finished paying off student loans. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture that was quietly obscene in price, and no personal clutter except a single black and white photograph of an older man I assumed was her grandfather. Maria stood by the window, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline. When she turned and shook my hand, her grip was firm without aggression, the handshake of someone who had mastered controlled dominance. We took seats around a glass conference table, and she got straight to the point. Anderson Holdings didn't tolerate chaos. They held 18% of Harrison Technologies. When Thomas was alive, they trusted the company. When Lena took over, they had concerns. Now I was telling her I'd been the majority shareholder all along, and she needed to understand what that meant for her investment. I matched her directness. I only created chaos when it served a purpose. And right now, it was necessary. The board had been treating Harrison like a personal ATM, preparing to sell her grandfather's legacy to private equity scavengers. I slid Olivia's folder across the table. Immediate executive compensation freeze, full departmental audit, leadership restructuring, monthly investor transparency reports, real ones, not sanitized nonsense. Maria reviewed the documents with sharp efficiency. The silence was heavy with concentration. Minutes passed. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer's personal number, the one she only used for emergencies or very good gossip. The message from Jennifer was blunt, almost amused in tone. The board was attempting to claim that Thomas had been mentally unfit when he signed the share transfer. Charles, apparently grasping for oxygen at the bottom of the corporate ocean, had hired an aggressive, high-profile legal firm to challenge the filing in court the following morning. I stared at the screen for a second, then let out a quiet laugh. Of course they were doing this, predictable to the end. I typed back immediately, telling Jennifer to forward Thomas's full medical clearance dated 3 weeks before the signing. I told her to include the neurologist's assessment, the oncologist's note, and almost as an afterthought, the Sudoku puzzle. The expert level 1 Thomas had completed that same afternoon in under 8 minutes. Perfect accuracy. Expert difficulty. Add a note for irony, I said. Jennifer responded almost instantly, telling me I was officially her favorite client and that she'd happily bill them for the puzzle. Maria looked up from her notes, catching the smile I hadn't bothered to hide. I told her the bad news, or what they clearly thought was bad news. The board was trying to overturn the transfer by claiming Thomas wasn't mentally competent. Her reaction wasn't concern, it was satisfaction. The kind of sharp, predatory smile you see on someone who enjoys watching amateurs panic. She made her position very clear. If my shares held, Anderson Holdings would back me completely. 18% voting alongside my 71 created an unmovable majority. If the transfer somehow failed, Anderson would pull its entire investment within 90 days and short Harrison Technologies on the way out. She wasn't sentimental. She was practical. She wanted competent leadership and wasn't going to watch her grandfather's legacy get dismantled by people who couldn't read a balance sheet without supervision. We spent the next hour deep in strategy. Not vague ideas, real plans, executive compensation freezes, operational audits, timelines, communication strategy with investors and employees. Maria asked sharp questions that sliced straight through surface-level thinking, pointing out blind spots I hadn't yet considered. By the time we wrapped up, my notebook was 17 pages long. My head hurt, and I had developed an uncomfortable respect for someone who could make me feel both challenged and energized at the same time. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, which felt ironic, considering I was spending it in a courtroom watching desperate men attempt to rewrite history. The Circuit Court of Cook County was exactly what you'd expect: beige walls, stiff benches, fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of anxiety and failed ambition. Charles was already there with his attorney, Thomas Thornton. Silver hair, custom suit, the kind of man who looked like he charged by the breath. Mark sat nearby, hollow-eyed and sleepless. Olivia had chosen her side and sat with us without hesitation. Judge Olivia Morrison entered promptly. Late 50s or early 60s. Gray hair pulled into a severe bun, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She surveyed the room with an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and was already tired of today's chapter. I liked her instantly. Thornton stood with dramatic flair, launching into his argument about manipulation and coercion. He claimed Thomas had been under heavy medication, cognitively impaired, and exploited by me during chemotherapy. Jennifer stood before being invited. Judge Morrison waved her on, clearly unimpressed with theatrics. Jennifer dismantled the argument piece by piece. Medical clearance from Thomas's oncologist confirming full cognitive capacity. Testimony from the notary who found Thomas lucid and deliberate. Confirmation from his personal attorney that Thomas understood every clause. Then, with perfect timing, Jennifer produced the Sudoku puzzle. Yes, Judge Morrison repeated slowly. A Sudoku puzzle, Jennifer explained calmly, expert level, completed in under 8 minutes. Perfect accuracy, supplementary evidence of course, but compelling. The gallery reacted. Even the court reporter struggled to suppress a laugh. Thornton looked like his law degree was evaporating in real time. Judge Morrison ruled decisively. The transfer was valid, legally binding. Case dismissed. By 11 that morning, I reconvened the board in the same room where they'd fired me 4 days earlier. This time, I sat in Thomas's seat. Mark resigned first. Immediately, I reminded him to take his mug. Then the work began. Anderson Manufacturing sale canceled, NeuralSync retained. Executive audits initiated, compensation frozen. The company wasn't saved yet, but it finally had a future. That company, unlike some of the people currently sitting around that table, was genuinely innovative. It produced real value, real ideas, real progress, and I made it clear that innovation would no longer be punished while incompetence was rewarded. I ordered a full operational audit of every department, with Olivia placed firmly in charge and backed by my complete authority. Anyone who couldn't clearly justify their role, their budget, or their contribution to the company's long-term health would be shown the door. No exceptions, no political shields, no legacy titles. All executive bonuses were frozen until we stabilized operations and addressed employee retention. I acknowledged that this decision might feel painful to some, but I also noted, politely, that 6-figure base salaries should provide sufficient insulation from hardship. If things truly got tight, I suggested they might consider cutting back on private club memberships or luxury retreats. No one laughed. That was fine. This wasn't meant to be funny. By early afternoon, the story exploded beyond the building. Financial media picked it up like dry brush catching fire. Bloomberg ran with, fired executive revealed as 71% owner of Harrison Technologies. The Wall Street Journal opted for drama, corporate coup. How Thomas Harrison's son-in-law took control from beyond the grave. CNBC booked me for a remote interview before I'd even finished my second cup of coffee. The anchor didn't waste time. She asked directly how I responded to critics claiming I had manipulated a dying man. I answered just as directly. I said critics should familiarize themselves with the medical documentation and the court ruling before making accusations they couldn't substantiate. Thomas Harrison was one of the sharpest businessmen I had ever known. He made a deliberate, informed decision to protect the company he built. If people wanted to call that manipulation, they were entitled to their opinions, but the law, the doctors, and the facts disagreed. She asked about firing board members on my first day. I corrected her. Technically, it was my 5th day. Details mattered. Mark had been actively attempting to sell profitable divisions for personal gain. That wasn't leadership. That was looting. I wasn't interested in playing nice with people who treated Harrison Technologies like a personal ATM. The interview went viral within hours. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 voicemails from other networks, 2 podcast requests, and one particularly interesting inquiry from 60 Minutes about corporate succession in family-owned businesses. I didn't return any calls immediately. Some momentum was better left to build. Lena called at 6:30, just as I was getting ready to leave. She began screaming before I could even get the phone fully to my ear. I let her go on for 45 seconds uninterrupted. About humiliation, about reputation, about how everyone was talking about how she fired her husband who apparently owned the company. When she finally paused to breathe, I spoke calmly. I told her I'd heard every word. Then I explained that she wasn't angry because of me. She was embarrassed because she fired her husband without realizing he owned 71% of her family's company. She looked impulsive and uninformed because she had been impulsive and uninformed. She wanted the CEO title, the aesthetic, the announcement, but skipped the due diligence. Business to her had been branding, a photo shoot, a caption. I told her to call me back when she was ready for a real conversation instead of a tantrum. Then I ended the call. That evening, I stood alone in Thomas's office, now my office, with a glass of the expensive whiskey he'd given me for my 30th birthday. He'd written on the card to save it for when I really needed it. The desk was immaculate. The chairs perfectly aligned. The view of Chicago at night, just as breathtaking as it had been during the countless late evenings we'd spent planning for exactly this moment. The city lights stretched out before me like a constellation of electric stars. Somewhere out there, Charles was probably screaming into a phone. Mark was likely updating his LinkedIn headline. Lena was already drafting a redemption arc for social media. And I was here, holding the responsibility of Thomas's life's work. This wasn't just revenge, though watching Mark's face when I fired him had been deeply satisfying. This was restoration. Thomas had built Harrison Technologies from nothing into something meaningful, employing thousands, creating value beyond quarterly reports. The board had been slowly hollowing it out, and he trusted me to stop them. I raised my glass to the skyline, to the quiet office, to Thomas's memory, and to whatever came next. The real work was just beginning. Audits, restructuring, protecting employees, running the company the way it was meant to be run. But for that moment, I allowed myself to enjoy it. The rare, quiet satisfaction of a plan executed cleanly, of trust honored, of a legacy defended. To new beginnings, I said softly.